CPS do its job?
I don't think they did. I think that girl would be alive if they hadn't done it. Because when I saw, I don't see how anybody could miss it.
At 5:10 p.m. on August 22, 2022, first responders were sent to a house on Avenue C in Brownwood, Texas, after someone inside reported that a 9-year-old girl was unresponsive. Her name was Hardy Quinn Hill. By that afternoon, the people around Hardy's family had already raised concern after concern. A neighbor had reported the smell coming from the property and the fact that the children were rarely seen outside. In another incident, Hardy was found alone near a rural cemetery around midnight, frightened, dirty, and desperately hungry. But what kind of mother drove roughly 20 miles, left her 8-year-old child in a cemetery after dark, and then went home without her?
She has told us that she's lost, that her mother left her at the cemetery in Trickham.
Police had been involved. Child welfare workers had opened cases. Relatives had tried to reach the children. And only weeks before the emergency call, authorities had been shown a video that appeared to prove the home was clean, safe, and suitable for them. But no child welfare worker had properly inspected the rooms where Hardy and her brother were actually living. So when investigators finally walked through the front door on August 22nd, the house they entered was not the house they had been shown. But to understand how so many warnings had been raised, yet no one had entered that home, the story had to return to Hardy's early life in Abilene. But before we begin, if you find this video interesting, please give it a like at the end and tell me what you think about the case. It really helps the channel. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. And don't forget to subscribe for more. Thank you. Before Hardy Quinn Hill became the center of a criminal investigation, she had been a lively little girl from Abilene, Texas, with a strong personality and a long list of things she loved. Hardy Quinn Raina Hill was born on October 11, 2012, to Dawn Faith Hill, who later became known as Dawn Faith Hill Flessner. She also had an older brother, Timothy, who was about 2 years ahead of her. Because he was still a minor, we will mostly refer to him as Hardy's brother. By the summer of 2022, Hardy was 9 years old and would normally have been around 4th grade age. According to her obituary, Hardy loved animals and often wanted to bring them home. She liked unicorns, drawing, writing, and coloring, but she also had a strong interest in things many children found frightening. She loved scary movies, skulls, and Halloween, and while most children counted down to Christmas, Hardy waited for October. She enjoyed trying to frighten the people around her, but she was not always very good at hiding what she was about to do. She would often start laughing before the prank was complete, so everyone knew she was preparing to jump out or make a scary face. That playful side of her also came out in the way her family described her movements. The obituary said there were many times when Hardy might trip on air, fall unexpectedly, then immediately jump back up and announce, "I'm okay," before carrying on as though nothing had happened. It became one of those small family stories that captured her personality because Hardy was always moving, always playing, and rarely embarrassed when something went wrong. She was also especially close to her brother. The two of them built forts together, played Minecraft, and spent time playing hide and seek. Because Hardy was small, she could squeeze herself into hiding places that were difficult to find, and that made the game even more entertaining for her. Night fishing became another family activity she loved. She went with her brother, her grandmother Jamie, and Dawn, and she found humor even in the small things that happened during those trips. If someone's fishing line broke, Hardy laughed. The family also took annual trips, including visits to Padre Island and San Antonio, but Luckenbach was said to be Hardy's favorite place. Hardy also had a close relationship with her maternal grandmother, Susie Wilson, who lived in Abilene. When Hardy stayed at Susie's house, they watched television, ordered pizza, and followed a simple bedtime routine. Before Hardy went to sleep, she and her grandmother sang, "Jesus loves all the children of the world." But the family life described in Hardy's obituary began to change after Dawn's marriage ended, and another woman entered the children's lives. Hardy would later be found dangerously underweight and unresponsive inside the Brownwood house. But the changes that led to that moment did not happen all at once. They began gradually. Dawn Faith Hill Flessner had previously been married to a woman named Sarah Flessner, and the two had been together for several years. During that time, Sarah helped raise Hardy and her older brother.
She was, most of the time, very happy. She loved getting her hair done and makeup. I think her cousin Mariah, she loved spending time with her and doing all that.
Sarah Hill Flessner was married to Hardy Quinn's mother and helped raise the girl for years.
If I'd have known it was as bad as it was, maybe I shouldn't say this, but I would have figured out how to get the kids out of the house. Legally or not.
When the two split up, she says Hardy's mother cut her off from the children and started dating a new woman, Jamie Anderson. Jamie Anderson and Hardy's mother, Dawn Hill, are now serving life sentences for the capital murder of Hardy Quinn. Susie says everything changed when her daughter met Jamie. She moved Dawn with their kids into a rundown home in Brownwood, Texas. There, Jamie, Dawn, and the kids grew increasingly isolated, and Wilson says her daughter's whole personality changed. She said they stopped allowing her to take the kids for sleepovers, and finally they stopped letting her come by at all. Tim Corley, pictured here next to the remains of the house the family lived in, called DFPS multiple times about bags of feces he was finding at the dumpster near his house, just down the street.
Did CPS do its job?
I don't think they did. I think that girl would be alive if they hadn't done it. Because when I saw, I don't see how anybody could miss it.
They informed him that everything was fine at the house, despite still never entering it. TPR confirmed that investigators for DFPS never entered the home despite multiple calls.
So tell me about why else this might not be an appropriate place for your...
This is where they left her. They left her here several times. But finally, August of 21, she left here and walked that direction to a house down there.
Just a month after Corley reported the family to DFPS, Dawn Hill abandoned Hardy at the Trickham Cemetery in the summer of 2021. According to a police report, it was a little past midnight in the pitch black. Wilson says it wasn't the only time this happened. This time, though, Hardy was scared enough to walk towards the only source of light in the vast, rural Texas darkness.
You can tell there's absolutely no lighting out here, as far as I've ever seen, and I've been here after dark, and there's really nothing to amount to light.
We asked Susie to ride with us to where Hardy was finally found.
And at the time, this road was not cliche like this. It was just like that one back there, just dirt, with everything grown up on it, and night, so animals are out, stuff like that. And from what I understand, I'm not quite sure if it was this house.
However, around 2020, Dawn and Sarah separated, and Dawn left with both children. For a short period, Dawn, Hardy, and her brother stayed with Dawn's mother, Susie Wilson, in Abilene. Hardy knew Susie's home, and she was comfortable there, but that arrangement did not last. Dawn soon began dating Jamie Faye Anderson, and after they had been together for about 6 months, Dawn moved both children into Jamie's property in Brownwood, a central Texas town with a population of roughly 20,000 people. The move created more than physical distance between the children and their grandmother because, according to Susie, Jamie began controlling how and when Dawn communicated with relatives. Whenever Dawn spoke to members of her family, Jamie remained in the room, so private conversations became difficult. Susie still tried to arrange visits with Hardy and her brother, but those plans were repeatedly canceled. At first, the children simply seemed harder to reach, and then the distance became more deliberate. Eventually, Jamie prevented Susie from seeing them altogether. Sarah also lost access to the children she had helped raise, and as the months passed, the circle of adults who could see Hardy and her brother became smaller, and the isolation was not limited to family members. A neighbor named Abby Wallace later described how rarely the children appeared outside the Brownwood house. She said, "You would not even believe they had kids because you never saw them." That observation was important because Hardy and her brother were not simply living farther away from relatives. They were becoming almost invisible to the people around them. The growing isolation worried Susie, but when she finally saw the house where her grandchildren were living, the condition of the property worried her even more. The property Dawn moved the children into stood in the 700 block of Avenue C in Brownwood, and from the outside, it already gave people reasons to worry. It was a 2-story building designed in a Western false front style, so the front rose higher than the roof behind it and made the structure resemble a small building from an old frontier town. However, by the time Hardy and her brother lived there, it looked less like a home and more like a deteriorating property that needed major repairs. When Susie Wilson first visited, she immediately noticed that the building was uneven and visibly damaged. The foundation was cracked, the floors did not feel level, and several of the basic services a family needed were either missing or not working properly. The house had no running water and no electricity throughout much of the property. It had no central heating, the stove did not work, and there was no functioning refrigerator. The indoor plumbing was also unusable, and a toilet had been placed outside on the front porch. Dawn told her mother that Jamie was renovating the building, so the conditions were presented as temporary problems that would eventually be repaired. But as time passed, the work did not appear to solve the most serious issues, and the children continued living there. One of the people who saw the problems from outside was a nearby neighbor named Tim Corley. He lived close enough to notice that the plumbing still was not working, and he later reported that the household was disposing of human waste in a dumpster beside his property. The smell did not remain contained inside the house or even within the boundaries of the yard. According to Corley, it traveled well beyond the front entrance and became impossible for nearby residents to ignore. He described it as so bad it would knock you down. But the smell was not the only thing that concerned him. Corley rarely saw Hardy or her brother outside, and on the few occasions when he did, he said the children appeared deeply unhappy. They were living in the middle of a neighborhood, yet they remained largely hidden from the people around them. Corley also tried to take food to the house, but instead of welcoming the help, Dawn and Jamie reacted aggressively toward him. That response only increased his concern because the children were rarely seen. The house had no proper plumbing, and the adults appeared hostile when a neighbor tried to provide something as basic as food. So, in 2021, Corley contacted the Texas Department of Family and Protective Services. Then he contacted them again. He reported the plumbing problems, the waste disposal, and the conditions surrounding the children. But he later said the department told him the family was fine. But Corley was not the only person who contacted the state, and when officials first responded to concerns about the home, they did not begin with a full investigation. When someone first reported concerns about the Avenue C property, the Texas Department of Family and Protective Services did not assign the case to a traditional abuse and neglect investigation. Instead, it was placed in a system known as alternative response, which was designed for families believed to need cooperation, support, or basic services, rather than an immediate and intrusive investigation. Under alternative response, workers could speak with parents, assess the family's needs, and recommend assistance, but they did not automatically make formal findings of abuse or neglect. The system was intended for situations considered less dangerous, where children were believed to be able to remain safely at home, while the family worked with the department. The assigned worker arranged to meet Hardy and her brother at a park near the home, but Dawn was present throughout the conversation. Neither child directly disclosed that anything was wrong while their mother sat nearby, so the meeting ended without an outcry of abuse or neglect. And instead of entering the house, the worker spoke with the person who had been presented as the landlord. That person was Jamie Anderson. Jamie assured the worker that the problems reported at the property had been corrected, and the worker accepted that explanation without walking through the home to confirm it. The case was then closed. Years later, DFPS Communications Director Marissa Gonzalez explained that policy would require seeing the home to assess safety. But in Hardy's case, the worker had not seen it. Family law attorney Lindsay Dion who had previously worked as an attorney for DFPS, later said the decision to use alternative response told her something important about how seriously the department had treated the report. She explained, "The first thing I do as a defense attorney is ask the department, is this an alternative response case? Because what that tells me is they don't care, and they're not going to do anything to my clients." She believed it had been searching for a way to finish the case, but the next warning would not come from a neighbor, a relative, or another complaint. It would come from Hardy herself after she was left alone in a rural cemetery in the middle of the night. During the summer of 2021, Dawn took 8-year-old Hardy to Trickham Cemetery in Coleman County, roughly 20 miles from Brownwood. Trickham was barely a town, with a population last recorded at around 12 people, and there was no post office, no streetlights, and very little around it beyond a highway, a church, a historic marker, the cemetery, and a handful of houses scattered through the darkness. At around midnight, Hardy was left there alone. According to what Susie Wilson later learned from Hardy's brother, this may not have been the first time Dawn had done it, but on this occasion, Hardy did not remain in the cemetery and wait for someone to return. Instead, she started walking. She left the graves behind, moved through the darkness, and walked approximately half a mile in search of help. There were no streetlights to guide her, so she relied on whatever she could see from the surrounding properties. At some point, she crossed a highway and reached a small road where only a few houses were visible. Hardy first noticed one home, but dogs near the property frightened her, so she kept moving. Then she saw another light in the distance and followed it. That light belonged to a home connected to Vicky Rice.
We have a night light that lights up a lot of the yard, and she said she saw the night light from the cemetery, that she went to this house first, but they have a lot of dogs, and she was afraid. And she came down, saw the light. We had a light on the front porch like we do every night. And that's why she came to the house, is what she said. She has told us that she's lost, that her mother left her at the cemetery in Trickham. The mother came into the house after we had already called the police. And so we clearly told her, I mean, she's not leaving until they get here. We've already called the sheriff's department, and we're not going to allow her to leave because we've already called. She said she had wandered off from them in the cemetery. That's not what the little girl told us. I mean, we never saw any of that night. We saw a very frightened, very young child that was very hungry and dirty. She ate everything that we had. We had made her a sandwich and she ate it and said she was still hungry, and we made her hot dogs and she ate those, and she drank milk, about 3 glasses of milk. But she said she was hungry, and we fed her. Yep.
I appreciate what you did for her.
I can't imagine. Wished it would have ended differently.
We all do.
So. But you know what? She's at peace. We know where she is. She's at peace. She went home way too early, but...
The Coleman County Sheriff's Office responded to the house that night, and unlike the Child Welfare Department, deputies treated what Hardy had described as a criminal matter. An 8-year-old girl had been found alone near a remote cemetery around midnight, and she had told the adults who helped her that her mother had left her there because she had been bad. The sheriff's office pushed for Dawn to be prosecuted, and the case eventually resulted in her pleading guilty to a felony child abandonment or endangerment offense. Dawn was convicted and placed on probation beginning in 2021, which meant a court had formally recognized that what happened at Trickham Cemetery was serious enough to warrant criminal consequences. However, the criminal case did not lead to Hardy and her brother being removed from Dawn and Jamie's care. The Texas Department of Family and Protective Services conducted its own assessment and determined that Dawn had neglectfully supervised her daughter. But even with that information, the department closed its case before Dawn's criminal proceedings had been completed. There was no continuing supervision of the family, no long-term safety plan, and no ongoing service that placed someone inside the household regularly enough to see how the children were living. Hardy and her brother remained with Dawn and Jamie, and the people responsible for monitoring their safety once again stepped away. Family law attorney Lindsay Dion, who had previously worked as an attorney for DFPS, later reviewed the way the case had been handled, and she said, "The department dropped the ball in a way I was not expecting to see at this level." And Susie would later return to one simple question: why had no one simply walked through the front door? That opportunity had already been missed more than once, but in June 2022, police were called to the household again, and this time, the report involved Dawn and Jamie themselves. So, in June 2022, only 2 months before Hardy died, police were called back to the household after a reported family violence incident involving Dawn and Jamie. It was serious enough to trigger another child welfare investigation and give authorities one more opportunity to see how the children were living. However, when caseworkers tried to assess the home, Dawn and Jamie refused to let them inside. They said they were worried about being exposed to COVID-19. So instead of walking through the property, checking the children's rooms, and confirming whether the earlier problems had been corrected, workers met the couple outside the house or in a public place. That meant the most important part of the investigation remained hidden. No one saw the interior that relatives and neighbors had been warning the state about for more than a year. Dawn and Jamie then offered another way to prove that the children were living in acceptable conditions. They submitted a video that appeared to show the inside of a clean and habitable home, with rooms that looked orderly and safe enough for a family. On the surface, the recording seemed to answer the questions the caseworkers had been asking, because it gave them what looked like visual evidence without requiring anyone to enter the property. So the video was accepted as a representation of the Avenue C house. But the rooms in that recording did not belong to the home where Hardy and her brother were living. According to court records and later reporting, Dawn and Jamie had filmed the video inside an adjacent property and presented it as though it showed their own home. Police later described the recording as false and misleading, with the intent to affect the outcome of the CPS investigation. So the video appeared to resolve the investigation, and the case was closed once again. About 2 months later, someone inside the Avenue C house called 911. It was Monday, August 22nd, 2022, and at approximately 5:10 p.m., City of Brownwood first responders were dispatched to the property in the 700 block of Avenue C. The caller reported that a juvenile inside the home was unresponsive. When paramedics arrived, they found 9-year-old Hardy Quinn Hill in an extremely serious condition. She was unresponsive, dangerously underweight, and showing no vital signs. Her body had become so thin from a prolonged lack of proper nutrition that the physical effects were immediately visible, and there were also bruises on her skin that raised further concern about what she had experienced inside the home. Paramedics reportedly transported Hardy to a local hospital where emergency measures were attempted, but she never regained consciousness. Later that evening, Justice of the Peace Harold Hogan pronounced her dead. Police later traveled to Susie Wilson's home in Abilene during the night and told her that her granddaughter had died. Susie had spent months being denied access to Hardy, and now officers were standing at her door with the news that she would never see her alive again. Back in Brownwood, detectives from the police department's Criminal Investigations Division began examining the Avenue C property. For years, the adults inside had managed to keep child welfare workers outside through assurances, canceled access, meetings in public places, COVID-related concerns, and finally a video of a different home. But after Hardy was found unresponsive, investigators finally walked through the front door. And what they discovered downstairs immediately showed why Dawn and Jamie had worked so hard to prevent anyone from inspecting the property. The area where Hardy and her brother lived had no running water, and investigators reportedly found human and animal waste inside the home, along with urine and large amounts of trash. The children shared a single mattress, but it was not a clean or safe place to sleep because trash and urine covered it. The food inside the house was also kept beyond the children's reach. cabinets had been locked and padlocks had been placed on both the refrigerator and the freezer. Hardy and her brother could not simply get something to eat when they were hungry because access to food was controlled by the adults upstairs. However, the entire house was not in the same condition. When investigators went upstairs, they found the area where Dawn and Jamie lived, and the contrast was immediate. Their rooms were clean, the space was air-conditioned, and there was food available. One investigator later said, "The upstairs looked like a completely different house than the downstairs." But Hardy was not the only child they found downstairs. Hardy's brother was still inside the downstairs area when investigators entered, and his condition showed that the deprivation in the home had not affected Hardy alone. A caseworker later described him as extremely thin, dirty, and visibly malnourished, with a face that appeared sunken after an extended lack of proper care. He was also so weak that he could not walk without assistance, so within hours of Hardy being found, authorities removed him from the property. He was initially placed in temporary foster care while officials searched for a suitable relative or another safe family placement. Hardy's death was treated as a homicide, but when police finally made their first arrest 5 weeks later, the charges were not yet for murder. On September 27, 2022, Brownwood police arrested 47-year-old Dawn Faith Hill Flesner and her 42-year-old partner, Jamie Faye Anderson. Both were charged with tampering with or fabricating physical evidence with intent to impair. Police were not only examining what had happened to Hardy inside the house, they were also examining the steps Dawn and Jamie had allegedly taken to prevent authorities from discovering the children's real living conditions. And one part of that evidence involved the video submitted during the June child welfare investigation. But as detectives continued gathering evidence, the case moved beyond the initial tampering charges. In December 2022, investigators presented their findings to a Brown County grand jury, and the grand jury returned indictments against both Dawn and Jamie. Each woman was accused of capital murder involving a child younger than 10, and both also faced charges connected to tampering with or fabricating evidence. Additional injury to a child allegations covered what prosecutors said had been done to Hardy and what her surviving brother had experienced inside the same household. The capital murder indictments carried no bond, while the announced tampering and injury to a child charges carried bonds of $250,000 each. Then, on December 17, 2022, at approximately 4:30 p.m., Dawn and Jamie were formally served with the new indictments while they were being held at the Brown County Law Enforcement Center. The charges revealed the full direction of the prosecution's case, but the evidence was never tested before a jury because neither woman ultimately went through a full trial. On June 1, 2023, Dawn Faith Hill Flesner appeared before Judge Mike Smith in the 35th District Court and pleaded guilty to capital murder. Judge Smith sentenced her to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, while the state agreed not to continue pursuing the death penalty. Brown County District Attorney Michael Murray explained that concern directly. The need to protect a young child from suffering more through a trial of his biological mother was a critical factor in reaching this decision. A full capital murder trial could have forced Hardy's brother to describe what happened inside the house, answer questions about his mother, and repeatedly return to the period in which he had lost his sister and been removed from the only home he knew. So the guilty plea secured a permanent sentence while avoiding another process that prosecutors believed could deepen his trauma. However, Jamie Anderson's case was still unresolved, and for several more months, she continued facing the possibility of trial. Then, on November 7th, 2023, Jamie appeared before the same court and also pleaded guilty to capital murder. Judge Smith sentenced her to life imprisonment without parole, and as part of the agreement, Jamie gave up her right to appeal the conviction. By the end of 2023, both women responsible for Hardy's care had admitted guilt and received sentences that ensured they would never leave prison. Although the court cases had ended, the response to Hardy's death had already spread far beyond the courtroom. Her uncle Devin created a Facebook group called Justice for Hardy, and by October 2022, more than 2,000 people had joined to follow the investigation and demand accountability. Community members also left toys, flowers, and other memorial items outside the Avenue C house, turning the property where Hardy had been found dangerously underweight and unresponsive into a place where people came to remember her. Then, on November 12, 2022, riders gathered at a gas station on U.S. Highway 377 South for a memorial motorcycle ride to Trickham Cemetery. But 5 people were injured in a collision connected to the event, with 3 taken to Hendrick Medical Center Brownwood and 2 declining treatment. The Avenue C house remained standing for more than a year after the convictions, but in May 2024, it was finally demolished, leaving behind an empty lot where the building had once hidden the children from relatives, neighbors, and child welfare workers. However, Hardy's family still had another painful issue to resolve. After
the distance, and because of the people who buried her here.
The last name that shows is Anderson. That is not her last name. She was never adopted. She was never anything. Anderson was this family name, which is the family of one of her 2 murderers.
After her death, Hardy had been buried in Trickham Cemetery, the same isolated place where Dawn had once left her alone after midnight. Her grave was positioned near Anderson family plots, and the headstone carried the name Hardy Quinn Hill Anderson.
Last name that shows is Anderson. That is not her last name. She was never adopted. She was never anything. Anderson was this family name, which is the family of one of her 2 murderers.
That name deeply upset Susie because Jamie had never adopted Hardy, and Anderson had never legally been part of her granddaughter's name.
So tell me about why else this might not be an appropriate place for your...
This is where they left her. They left her here several times. But finally, August of 21, she left here and walked that direction to a house down there. You can tell there's absolutely no lighting out here, as far as I've ever seen, and I've been here after dark, and there's really nothing to amount to light.
And every few weeks, Susie traveled from Abilene to Trickham to visit the grave, and when she arrived, she rearranged the glass beads and small decorations so they covered the Anderson portion of the headstone. But visiting was not enough because Susie wanted Hardy moved away from the cemetery, away from the Anderson family plots, and closer to the relatives who had been denied the chance to protect her. So for almost 2 years, the family worked through the process required to move her remains, and in late October 2024, Hardy was finally exhumed and taken to another cemetery closer to Abilene.
All a waste, and we look at it that way. This should never ever have happened in the first place, but we accomplished getting her home.
Thank you for getting her home.
You're welcome.
She'll be happier here. Here.
It's the end of a long trial, so to speak. She is now where she should have been, when this happened. In other words, we don't get any do-overs, unfortunately, but at least she's home. She's home.
However, those words, Susie, stood in sharp contrast to the obituary published after Hardy's death. The obituary ended by saying, "She will always be remembered for her curious nature. She will never be forgotten." But the obituary appeared to have been written by Dawn. So the first public account of Hardy's life had been shaped by the same household that concealed how she had really been living. But Hardy's story did not belong to that obituary alone. She was the child who loved animals, Halloween, drawing, fishing, and building forts with her brother. She was the little girl who fell, stood back up, and told everyone she was okay. And that's where this case comes to a close. What do you think about everything that happened? Share your thoughts in the comments. If this story stayed with you, there are more cases on the channel that explore situations just as disturbing. Make sure to subscribe, leave a like, and share the video. It helps keep stories like this from fading away. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.